come to D before and participated in the computer bowl that some of you know we had, but has never really sat down for an interview. And we also invited Chad Hurley and Steve Chen, who you already saw. And then very late in the process, after the billion-dollar lawsuit was filed, Viacom suggested that maybe we would want to have Philippe Domon, and we said, well, yeah, that's a good idea, but the only slot we have is right between the YouTube guys and the CEO of Google. Do you really want that slot? Because that's it. And they said yes. And so I'm now going to bring out the other bookend of the Google assault on Viacom, Eric Schmidt. Eric?
Hi, Walt. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
I've never been introduced as a bookend before.
Bookend. Well, a flanker, a pincer, or something. I don't know what the right term would be. And I suppose we should start off with the Viacom lawsuit. I'm sure your lawyers have told you you're not supposed to talk much about it.
Oh, I can talk about it lots.
Good, great. We'll talk about it lots. I mean, doesn't he have a point? He owns and has paid a lot of money for the production of a bunch of this content. We're apparently violating his copyright in the eyes of some of his lawyers this morning, and but he owns it, right? So doesn't he have a right to decide who can distribute it and get paid for distributing it and so forth?
Well, you know, the Viacom lawsuit was probably just a mistake.
Probably just a mistake.
Yeah, because the underlying dispute is about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and whether there's a shared responsibility around takedown or not. And we read the law, it's pretty clear that there's a safe haven for sites on the internet and others that host content that is incorrectly or illegally uploaded, as long as they take it down promptly. And indeed, we do that. We're busy building tools that will automate as much of that process as we possibly can, because it's crazy to have people doing this stuff manually. And I think they just made a mistake.
What should they have done?
They should have waited for the tools.
Well, why should they wait, and why should they believe that you're going to come up with the tools?
Because we have lots of other people using them.
But why shouldn't he say even one day of using my material, and we've talked to you before about this, even one day is an outrage because we paid for this. I mean, do you believe in intellectual property and copyright?
Absolutely. And there are lawyers who have been to the school that says that intellectual property is a full property right over which you have absolute control. There's another set of lawyers who apparently have all been to the Supreme Court that have said that it is in fact a shared responsibility. And the important principle about copyright here is that Google actually operates under the DMCA for lots of our properties. We happen to be sued by Viacom over this particular issue, which is largely a business negotiation, I think. And had they simply waited, the tools that are in development now would have addressed most of their complaints, I think.
But why should the onus be on them to, I know I'm rephrasing my question, but why should the onus be on them to wait for you, a bunch of smart engineers, to come up with some tools? Why shouldn't the onus be on you to say, until the tools come out, we're not going to...
Because we follow the law. The law does not require us to build tools. We're building the tools to make their lives easier because we think it's good for everybody. The ultimate outcome of copyright is going to be a complex mix of user authentication, producer authentication, and user choice. And the more we can automate those tools, the better. From a legal perspective, which is what you were asking, we met the terms of the law a year ago, we met it 6 months ago, we meet it today.
Okay. Let me turn it around a little, because when Chad and Steve were out here, there was a question Gary Shapiro from the Consumer Electronics Association asked, which struck me as very interesting, which was, you have this community around YouTube, you have other communities and other parts of your product portfolio, and you know, one approach to this is a technological approach, which you're talking about with tools. There are, let's have a lawsuit with each individual instance, whether it's Google or other companies around the web and other old media companies. Let's have a separate business negotiation about everything. But another approach is to say, you know, we live in a country where the copyright laws, including the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is supposed to be the modern one, are entirely written from the point of view of the copyright holders. Yes, you have a safe harbor because either you, or probably not Google actually at the time, but some companies like you, primarily I think AOL, hired a bunch of lawyers and got a loophole. You got a get out of jail free card somewhere in the bowels of that law. But these laws are written entirely from the point of view of the copyright holders. They all say nothing can be copied. There's nothing in them that recognizes the rights of consumers. I'm not even talking about Google now, but consumers. If you have a community at YouTube, why don't you mobilize it to get political change rather than just be satisfied with either defeating lawsuits or cutting deals?
There's a line of advocacy that we probably should not cross as Google. Google tries very hard to be an independent and unaffiliated arbiter, of what the best search results are. And there's always this line that we have to be very careful about. My personal view may be different from the law, but the fact of the matter is that in the United States, we're governed by the DMCA. The various people who have suggested the DMCA be changed have various vested interests. As you know, DMCA was signed in 1996 under heavy lobbying from the Hollywood and other things. And what's interesting is it's being turned around from their perspective in a negative way. But it is nevertheless, from my perspective, it's a pragmatic issue. My own view is that the user content explosion is so profound and so obviously a big phenomena that it will eventually cause the world to change. It's also worth noting that the DMCA is U.S. only and that the laws differ by country. And it's a real problem if you're trying to run a global site as we are, because the laws differ and you have to deal with each, obviously you have to subject to all the different ones.
Yeah, but just to continue on this theme for a minute, I don't think it's in the Ten Commandments or the Constitution. The terms of the DMCA are not etched in there. It's a law. It can be changed. It can be amended. It
By
can
the
be
Congress,
repealed.
not
by the Congress. I also, the last time I checked, Google actually had a right, and the people at Google or the community around YouTube all have a right to express their opinions to Congress.
Absolutely.
And, I'm not sitting here telling you what your policy should be on this, but I would say, and lots of other people would say, that there's some sort of imbalance in these copyright laws.
One of the great
which
things
is not to say, by the way, that there isn't such thing as copyright or there isn't such thing as IP.
What's great about it is that's your view, and a lot of people agree with you. And the YouTube communities form so naturally around these things that it's a reasonable expectation that such a community will ultimately drive that change. What's important from a Google perspective is that we enable that, not that we particularly endorse one political view or the other. And that's where we draw the line.
Okay.
Because we don't do content.
You don't do content, but you enable content.
We absolutely enable content, especially for end users. We're very end user focused.
I mean, actually, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were saying we're just platforms enabling content in their session last night, that they're not real, entertainment or content companies. So in that sense, you're aligning yourself with their point of view on that, of what the right role for the company is in this?
Well, I can't speak for them. From a Google perspective, Google is run around end users, right? It's all around end user testing, end user happiness, essentially. And all of the innovation is really about helping them understand information better, providing more valuable services on various kinds of devices. And there is a huge, essentially, in traditional terms, platform shift from a model which is sort of a hardwired platform to this much more diverse, sort of more porous platform model that is the web. And it's very exciting, right? And it's how these platforms and services will evolve. It's becoming more confusing because it's becoming more embedded and more powerful. There's no single answer to that anymore.
So Steve Ballmer was talking about here yesterday, and of course he was talking about how they're way behind you in search and in advertising. We know they just spent $6 billion to try to buy some expertise on the advertising side in particular, and tried to buy DoubleClick before you did, and he got very close to my face and in a very loud voice said, "We're determined." What did he say? "We're determined, and we're patient, and we're gonna make big strides here." But one of the things he said is that the presentation of search results, the user interface for presenting the results, has been relatively stagnant. Would you agree with that? Is there a need for, I mean, for all of your phenomenal success, is there a need to make some strides in the way that you present the results?
Well, this past week we announced something which we call universal search, which is the blending algorithmically of results from video and audio and books and so forth and so on, news, which is a big component of it, directly in the search results. So far, the feedback is that people love it. We, of course, had tested it before we rolled it out, and it looks like we'll roll it out pretty soon worldwide. So that's an example where a relatively simple presentation has been augmented. I don't think we're going to go very far from the single search box. One of the things to know is that we're seeing tremendous success with personalization of Google. It's called the iGoogle page.
Yep.
And many, many, many millions of people are now personalizing their search experience. From my perspective, this was a surprise because I figured people would like that very simple box. But in fact, if you think about it, people know what they care the most about, and so they personalize their page. And these new web gadgets, as they're called, allow you to have a highly personalized experience. So what's happening is you have sort of the corpus of Google available to these gadgets. The gadgets themselves can interact with each other, and then you can have a personalized platform experience. It's a very, very powerful model, and it's likely to be one of the major ways in which people consume information. The other thing to note about iGoogle is that that personal experience also extends to non-PC, non-Mac platforms, anything that can handle a reasonably sophisticated browser. So all the new generation of mobile phones and new devices should be able to run them, and that's pretty exciting.
It is. It's similar to some other things that you can do on the web, NetVibes, even My Yahoo to some extent, and on the desktop with the dashboard on the Mac and the sidebar on Vista. But still, when you type in a search, even from an iGoogle page in that box, it looks a lot like it looked 3 years ago. Now, maybe that's good, maybe that's fine, but in the world you live in, 3 years is a really long time for something to still look pretty much the same.
But disagree a little bit, because although the look may be the same, the amount of content and the types of content are vastly larger. With all the new content that's available on Google, the index is infinitely larger. There's so many different services.
I'm talking about the UI and the presentation.
The other thing that we did is at the very top left-hand corner of most Google pages, you now get a menu of services, essentially online applications of one kind or another, so that you can not only have a personalized page, but you can also then go into the depth of the data services that are offered by Google, again, worldwide.
Why don't you have a better sense of the preview of the pages that you bring up? I know I'm being a little granular here, but some competitors, Ask.com is one, have a little icon, and if I mouse over it, I can see what that page would look like before I commit to clicking to going over there. Is that?
We have looked at that. It hasn't been it has not tested particularly strongly one way or the other, and there are some latency issues with such previewing.
So that's not something you're interested in?
Well, we're always interested in, we're always experimenting. So if you look, for example, in Korea, we just announced a very different browsing interface, which actually has pop-ups as you browse along the fundamental home page. So we're experimenting. The difference of the user interface stuff is culturally specific, country specific, language specific, and you'll see more of that.
Also here at this year's D, we had a demonstration of Mahalo, Jason Calacanis' new product, which is a kind of a back to the future thing. You probably know what it is, where he has human editors, and his contention is that for a certain percentage of particular kinds of searches, your algorithms aren't very satisfying to people. He showed a little video of people saying, I can't figure this out, or I'm not getting what I want. And there were areas like, I want a particular hotel in a particular city. There is this enormous search engine optimization industry, which is essentially gets up in the morning every day and tries to game your system. And it isn't always good for end users. And in some categories, I can tell you just as a user, I think he's right. I'm not saying his solution is the right solution, but I think he's right that there's an issue. It does frustrate me, at least, when I go to look for a hotel. Maybe this is just me, but the things that I want most are the website of that hotel and some sort of review that I can trust. But instead, it's just pages, it seems to me too often, of brokers, middlemen companies that claim to be able to get me a room for a certain price, but I don't even know which hotel I want to stay at. Is there a solution to this? Is Jason's solution the right solution, to go back to the Yahoo directory approach and put, at least for some searches, put some human editors in, or can you do it with changing your algorithms?
We believe we can do it with changing the algorithms. The problem with these human approaches is you can always pick a category, and a very talented human editor can always do a better job. The problem, of course, is that it doesn't scale. It doesn't scale to 100 languages worldwide and the billions of pieces of information that people care about. There are new artificial intelligence techniques that can use both the personal information that you have as well as all of the other information and signals that we have that can produce a pretty good approximation of what a human editor can do. The thing that you're referring to we call index spam. People who are paying money to try to generate false results and or overwhelm the user.
Not paying money to you, but
no, they're paying
money
to other people. The classic example is called a link farm, where people take 5,000 computers and they cross-link each other. Yeah. Well, we, of course, can detect link farms now, and our software is very good at that. But there are other attacks that people try, and because it's in their financial interests. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the web is now so important that there's a certain amount of misinformation that's commercial or manipulative in nature, or you could call it biz information, or some term where it's sort of boosted, if you will, by financial interests. And the people have to learn that sometimes the marketing has been infused with the result, and we try to detect that as much as we can. The particular issue with reviews is one that I, for example, notice all the time, and we have better approaches that are in development for that.
You do, because I think it is an issue, whatever we think about whether Jason has a business or someone else has a business. Let's talk about advertising for a minute. You have this phenomenally successful contextual advertising business. I will tell you, just as a consumer, that I appreciate that you haven't done sort of garish, flashing ads. The ads are text. They're clearly demarcated from the algorithmic results, which some other search engines didn't do. I mean, I think you've done a lot of things there correctly. At D1, I don't know if you were here, but I remember that Sergey made the point that those ads were great because he was able to find a green laser there, and Larry said that he was able to find some kind of metal shed for his yard or something. I don't know. Those were their examples, but
I'm sure that's true,
business.
Given the two.
It's been a very good business. You obviously have just bought a company that does display ads. So are we going to see is this more of a strategic thing for you to be in the business of serving and placing display ads all around the web, or is this a portent of your changing your pages to have a lot of display ads on them?
Well, we're certainly not going to do the latter. A little bit of background for everybody is that we have a different view about advertising. We think that the ads themselves have value. There are lots of examples where the value of ads shows up in our systems. We show fewer ads now because we can target them better. Those ads themselves have become more valuable, therefore our revenue has grown. So we're showing fewer ads per page now than we ever have. So more targeted, more personalized ads are the core part of how our business model works. Of course, we did that very successfully with text ads. We believe that the same technology and approach can be applied to what are traditionally known as display ads and other kinds of ads, radio ads, television ads.
To make them contextually relevant.
To make them more relevant in the scene. And every time we have done that, we have seen a significant improvement in user satisfaction, advertiser satisfaction, and frankly, the value of the ads goes up. So it's a good business. It's different from traditional advertising models where if you show more ads, you make more revenue. In our case, if we show fewer, more targeted ads, we literally make more revenue because we run an auction. And the auction is, as you know, is a second price dynamic auction. The second price dynamic auction produces a higher price. Therefore, all is good. And we know the ads work because there is a process where the value of the ads and the ultimate cost per acquisition, so-called CPA, is solved through ad and display tracking tools that are in development at Google. So the sum of all of that means that as we broaden our mission from an advertising perspective, we really want to solve the advertising problem in general. In other words, we want to bring engineering to advertising as best we can.
So you're not just buying DoubleClick to go on with what they've been doing. I'm not trying to get you to criticize what they've been doing, but you want to actually use that as a vehicle to apply some of what you've done in the search ads to this category.
That is correct. If you look at what advertisers want, they want measurability, efficiency, reliability. They want the system to work, and these are big systems. They work at scale. DoubleClick's customers, as best we can tell, given the ability we can see into them and the current, because we haven't closed yet, are mission-critical, large corporations that use them every day, all the time. It's a core component of their business. If we can make that business, again, more measurable, stronger, more targetable, it's good for the advertiser. It's obviously good for the publisher of the information. We can also, using our tools, show fewer, better ads, which is good for the end user, which is the ultimate goal.
Why do you keep saying end user?
Because
this is not a corporate IT product, Google's products for the most part.
The reason
you have direct users. They're not end users.
Thank you for direct users.
All right.
It's important to distinguish because the company is run based on the testing and sampling of what you call direct users rather than some other strategic goal. So we will, for example, trade off revenue or other things in favor of an end user benefit. There have been numerous cases where some very smart set of product managers have come in with some very clever revenue enhancing idea, which when tested does not improve end user satisfaction. We don't do it.
So that's the don't be evil, that's the do the right thing?
Well, don't be evil is both a slogan, but it's also a way of getting people to think before they act. So one way to think about don't be evil, and when I started in the company, which was a few years ago, I thought this was a joke. And so I'm sitting around the table, and it's a small company, and we're in the one conference room. And there's some conversation about this revenue issue. And one of the engineers, whose name was Ron, slams his fist on the table and says, "That's evil." And I thought, wow. So then there was this big debate as to whether it's evil. And it turns out he was right. And we did not do that particular thing. And my point here is it's an internal way for people to understand how they should be making choices. Since there's no book on what's evil and what's not, it forces the conversation.
The collected speeches of George W. Bush have a lot about evil and good in them. So, let's talk about evil for a minute, though, because there's an increasing point of view that you are accumulating so much power. At first, a couple of years ago, it was so much power on the web, and now it's sort of so much power in the advertising market in particular, that you could be evil, whether you say you are or not. Is it a good thing for the advertising market? Is it a good thing for publishers and content owners for you to have like 80% of the power to serve and place ads?
Well, our model is based on real performance, and I understand the concern because I've obviously heard it and read it. Ultimately, we're different from some of the previous incarnations of large companies, large monopoly power that people have been alleging, because we are one click away from losing that end user. Advertisers, by the way, can choose to advertise on many, many sites, not just us. We have a whole bunch of commitments that we've made to our constituencies. In particular, we've made a commitment that we won't trap user data. That if you, for example, become dissatisfied with Google services, we will make it easy for you to switch to another service. And there's two reasons for that. One is it's clearly for you as a user, but it's also important because it serves as a meter, if you will, or a discipline on the company and on the teams in the company, because it forces them to compete on a product by product or an integration basis. They can't just say, hey, we've got them trapped. It forces excellence.
But Eric, you're an incredibly smart guy. You obviously know that. I'm not talking about whether somebody would switch from iGoogle to my Yahoo or something. I'm talking about consumers don't know who's serving these ads on these different sites. They're not even on a Google site. They're on some other site, and DoubleClick is the company that serves the ads. Now it's you. It's Google. A page might have a bunch of Google, AdSense, AdWord, whatever you call it, ads in the corner.
AdSense for content.
Okay. and then banner ads, and all of a sudden, the difference between whenever you close this deal and before is you're controlling all of it on that guy's page, on that website. Is that good? Is that a healthy thing?
Well, it's the easiest answer to understand is that the publisher of the content gets to make that decision, and they get to make the decision whether it's a good thing or not. So far, they've been voting that it is, but every day they.
But they haven't had the chance to vote for a Google that controls both the display and the contextual.
As you pointed out, there's a direct competitor with DoubleClick, which is a quantive. And you started our conversation by mentioning that acquisition. So indeed, they do have a choice. And they can decide to mix and match. There's no particular reason why you have to choose one versus the other. Each one of our products has to stand on its own.
Talk to me about how you evaluate Microsoft as a competitor. In other words, you know what business you're in, and you know more than you're probably willing to say here about what businesses you want to get into. You know your strengths and you know your weaknesses, and you've been competing with them for a long time in different companies and incarnations. Steve Ballmer said that they've had a couple of traditional business models and lines of business, desktop computing, obviously, enterprise products, and they now have two new ones, one of which is advertising and one of which is consumer electronics kind of products, the Zune and so forth, the Xbox. They actually demoed another hardware product here. But he put advertising as one of their core businesses, you know, essentially saying, obviously it's not as big and they're not as successful at it, but that it's on a plane with Windows and Office. Do you worry about that? They have 78,000 people, they have a lot of money.
Well, I think you always worry about a company that has that percentage of the platform business in terms of Windows. And that's been true for many years, certainly in my professional career. Advertising is different from the other businesses. If I, for example, one of the things that people miss about advertising is it's not a zero-sum game. If a new entrant enters the market, it just creates more choices, more opportunities. Because our auction clears at the market value to the advertiser, they're not going to somehow reduce the amount of money that they're giving us. They may augment their money, they may augment their spending, and the competition is in fact good. It creates more choices for end users, it creates more choices for advertisers. As you pointed out earlier, it creates more choices for publishers. So I think the competition is very good. The advertising business is harder than it looks like. Again, when I started at Google, I thought, oh, it's sort of a toy system. It's, you know, it's very straightforward. You take these keywords and so forth and so on. The computer science and the complexity of running these systems, especially when they're under attacks like the ones that you mentioned about commercial spam and so forth, are very, very sophisticated. Google has some of the top computer scientists in the world and some of the largest data centers and supercomputers and so forth that work on this. So again, the challenge is high, but the opportunity is worth it. The current structure of the market is you have Google's network and Yahoo's network, and you have Microsoft trying to enter, as they have for a while.
So talk about Yahoo in a similar way as a competitor. My partner, Kara Swisher, wrote a piece recently suggesting that maybe they'd be better off thinking themselves as a media company and not being in this advertising technology business. Would that be your advice, or how do you look at their whole situation?
I don't think it's appropriate for me to give Yahoo advice. I'm not there. Every company faces its own challenges in a different way. Yahoo is a combination of both very interesting and very successful content and a technology base. And many people have suggested that those two should be separated. From our perspective, Google is a technology company, a product company, an enabler of these services. We're not in the content business. And we're very proud of the quality of our search and advertising and all the new applications and the new web applications that are getting developed. And that's our focus.
There's been a lot of rumors over the last few months on the web that you are getting into the cell phone business in some way, shape, or form. Some kind of software. I don't know, there have been people say it's going to be an actual Google handset, maybe a Google phone carrier. It is pretty clear you have some work going on somehow, somewhere around the cell phone business. Can you talk about what you're doing there?
Yeah, We've been internally saying mobile, mobile, mobile. And the simple reason is that everybody here in the room has their mobile phone with them. Everybody in the world has their mobile phone with them. When I travel, all I hear is the sound of mobile phones going off. And the mobile phones have historically been pretty weak from a standpoint of data connectivity and browser capability. The browsers have been crippled. The data networks have been slow. The data networks now with the 3G rollout are roughly 1 megabit or greater. That's sufficient for some pretty interesting applications. The browsers is a next generation of browsers, epitomized by the iPhone. I'm on the board of Apple, so I should disclose that. But the iPhone is a good example of a
Oh, Steve was here waving it around, and I've held it for 20 minutes, so I know what you're talking
That's
about.
right. More than I've held it.
What? You're a board member.
That's right. I'm waiting for mine. So in any case, this new generation of browsers is very, very powerful. So the combination of the 3G network and the browser really means that you, instead of saying mobile, 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 I should be saying apps, apps, apps. And the model on phones is not going to be the simple Google search page with this long set of results and all the ads on the right and so forth and so on that everybody is used to, because the screens are so constrained. And as fast as the processors are getting and as good as the battery life and so forth, the screens are not going to be this big. They're going to be smaller, and so they're going to have different kind of applications. The applications are going to be web-enabled. They're going to use either Java or JavaScript. And we, Google, are building a lot of those applications in conjunction with the operators. The operators have various complicated business models for distributing those apps and using them, and a few of them are beginning to be successful. Our most successful partnership right now is with KDDI, which is a Google the number 2 in Japan. It's Google Search, Google Ads, very, very profitable. What's interesting about the ads in the mobile phone is that they are twice as profitable or more than the non-mobile phone ads because they're more personal. So if you think about the phones, there are more camera phones now that are in phones than more digital cameras that are in phones than digital cameras. Every phone either has a GPS or a pseudo GPS. Therefore, and is also a computer. So therefore, for purposes of argument, every end user computer is a phone, a GPS, and a camera with a modest-sized screen. The sum of all of that is a very interesting apps platform. And those apps are going to be doing all sorts of personal things. You have all the Google data repository behind it, all the personal information. The sum of that is a whole new platform play. So indeed Google.
But are you going to just, for you to write apps for mobile phones is not a new thing. I have on my Trio Google Maps, people in this room have, various, not just through their browser on their phone, but you've written a number of clients that do search and other things, and you have specially formatted Google pages that look better on these crummy cell phone browsers. So the idea that you're going to write a bunch of apps is, mildly interesting, but that's not what all these web rumors are talking about you doing something more fundamental. Like I said, some say you're going to make a phone. Some say you're going to make an entire platform for phones. That's a much bigger deal than just writing apps for the existing platforms.
In order to write those apps, there are also mid-layers that have to be built that actually essentially federate the services and make them available. There's a lot of other technology that has to be built. So when I say apps, I don't mean just the simple app. I mean the infrastructure required to host and make that app personal, extensible, shareable, and so forth. The new model of these phones is going to be person to person, right? It's going to be phone to phone. People are going to be sending information, videos, humor, data, and so forth and so on. It's sort of SMS gone wild in a fundamental way. So from our perspective, we're building that software, and we're doing it with partnership. We just announced a partnership with LG and with Samsung to do some similar apps. The most successful of the Google mobile phone apps so far is Google Maps, but there are many more coming.
So this middle layer, this platform thing, Steve, I'm sure you've heard Steve talk about this because you're on his board, Steve Jobs, not Steve Ballmer. I don't think you're on his board yet, but talking about crippled software, I can't remember his terms, baby software and bad software on phones today. And he has obviously done a port of the Mac operating system to this iPhone. Is Google, as a technology company, a software company, able to step up and do what Microsoft, for instance, does, which is to write a whole software environment, an operating system or something that could go on a whole bunch of kinds of phones, and then your apps and maybe other people's apps would run against that?
Without announcing new products and new API layers, let me describe that the model is not as simple as an operating system and a platform, which is sort of the traditional way we talk about this. It's really a set of services. This week, in fact, yesterday, Google had a developer day, which is all focused on building the piece part apps, the so-called gadgets and the infrastructure that are embeddable in this new platform. The most likely scenario from a Google perspective is to build some, if you will, inspirational platform apps, but primarily focus on getting third parties to do it, because that's where the innovation will come from.
Okay. All right. Why don't we take some questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right here.
Eric, you've talked, wanted to ask about Google Gears. It seems like up until now, Google has mainly been something we use when we're connected. With Google Gears, are you going more directly against traditional client software companies, and will we be using Google when we don't have internet access more?
Well, as you know, Google Gears is an open source set of software that we've released essentially today, which allows you to have your internet experience when you're not connected to the internet, and then when you reconnect it, it does the necessary resyncing. It does it with a relatively straightforward database. It's one of the biggest requests that we get in our new Google Apps model, where people they want to depend on the web service. They want to be able to keep their personal information somewhere, but we all understand that we're all on airplanes or in places which have poor connectivity, and it's a pretty uniform solution to that. So we'll see. The important thing about Google Gears is it's not targeted just at Google. We're trying to do it with a whole bunch of companies to try to essentially create this new opportunity around platforms. When the term you used was go against the traditional client software companies. To my knowledge, all of the existing client software companies are offering variants of web services to access client software for precisely this reason. Everyone's moving to the web.
Thank you.
Esther?
Hi, thank you. Last year I asked about personalization, maybe not here, but somewhere, and it happened. The question now, it's an advertising thing, both what Google's own experience is and what you're seeing and what you expect DoubleClick will make happen. At one end, there's a lot of click fraud, and there are lots of arguments over how bad it is, whatever. People don't really care about click fraud. They care about paying for clicks that aren't valuable. And so that means a better way to do it may be to pay per action, whether it's purchasing history or whatever. It requires more tracking, but you're pretty good at that. So where do you see that going?
Today, the majority of our revenue comes on a click basis, so people pay for the click. And the sophisticated advertisers have teams, that is, groups that actually measure their conversion rates and essentially construct their own CPA. I was surprised to discover how proprietary they view that whole process. They don't want, for example, to turn that over to Google or to anyone else. They view it as sort of a key insight into their business. They know if they do this, the following thing happens, and so forth. So far, the click fraud issue has not turned out to be a big one. We're always worried about it. We're always trying to detect it, and so forth. But remember that the auction is self-policing, in that if there were, for example, an infinite amount of click fraud, then eventually the conversion rate, the actual selling rate, would decline, and the advertiser would say, hey, I'm not getting my money out of this advertising. I'll move my money to some other solution or some other company or some other meta group around advertising. The same technology argument should work pretty well for display ads.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Eric. Tai Kwan from TPG, the buyout shop. I had a question around the domain industry, domain parking, domain tasting, and all the associated practices. What is Google's position on that entire industry?
We have a business that we acquired that does, in fact, do some domain hosting and ad serving for domains. We've been careful to try to evaluate that based on end-user feedback as opposed to just purely trying to load these things up with fake domains, because we don't want to be part of the problem, we want to be part of the solution. So our solution seems to have better conversion and tests better around essentially domain management. There are companies in the industry that are essentially, they essentially take and they fool end users. They claim they're one thing and they're really something else. We have software that can detect that pretty well, although there are some counterexamples. And every few months we come up with yet another attack and then we eliminate it. So with respect to domain hosting, there's some legitimate players and there's some that are essentially manipulative.
Hi, Eric. Herbert Kim with CodeWorks in the UK and fellow Tiger class of 1989. It'd be an understatement to say you guys have obviously had a pretty good run over the last 6 or 7 years, and you've obviously got a lot of momentum, et cetera, et cetera. But given the dynamism of the technology and the media industries, inevitably one would suspect dark clouds will arise and problems will come and competition, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess I'm wondering what you and your team are doing to build into the DNA of Google that will allow it to be so-called built to last when perhaps some of these harder times arrive.
You know, companies are motivated by culture, and the culture is determined by the people, the leadership, the tone, the way people view themselves. We've worked very hard to build something that would outlast me, outlast the current management, outlast everybody. Because we think that the opportunity for building a different kind of company is correct. The company is run in a different way, the empowerment model is different, and we've talked about it, so I don't need to repeat it for this audience. And those seem to be pretty much likely to survive any of the possible either competitive issues or maturation issues, and I don't think those are going to change. The other thing to know about companies is that they do, in fact, have to change. Last night, Steve Jobs, when you asked him what was the company like 10 years ago, he said he cast away the past to move to the future. And I think that's a good message to all companies. We're always thinking about what's next, what is our great opportunity, and not rest on our laurels. And we try to instill that as values and values in our company. There's a tremendous number of new people who are joining the company for whom this is day one in their Google experience, and they will shape the culture going forward. And the great companies, and many of them represented by people who've been on the stage before me, have all been through those transitions, and I'm quite confident that we'll get through them too.
Thanks.
Craig Foreman from Earthlink. And I should disclose we have a long history and flourishing, nuanced relationship with Google. Eric, I'd like to ask you a little bit, lest this audience go home with more paranoia. Tell us a little bit about the experiences you've felt personally as you've worked on radio ads, the DMARC acquisition, and some of the experimentation that Google is doing on non-IP-based forms of media advertising. Should we be thinking that it may take longer and be more costly an effort to see some of the techniques that Google has been so successful with emerge in other media types?
Hi, Craig. Each of the advertising models is different and they work for a reason. Radio advertising is the obvious example. If we could get a unique identifier for the radio that's in your car, we could certainly target it with higher quality ads. We'd show fewer ads. You would be happier, the advertiser would be happier, and the programmer would be happier because they'd be using less bandwidth for the ad, which of course then allows them to do even more programming or whatever they want to do. Unfortunately, the technology doesn't allow that. Each of the economic models has a different profitability model. So, for example, radio is not as profitable, for example, today as text ads because it's not as well developed. We've looked at the ad models, and there's a number of people who've studied this and have indicated that, for example, radio as an advertising business is under-monetized. It's relatively poorly distributed in terms of the number of advertisers and the reach that it has. So in the theory of trying to help people out by building stronger and more durable advertising businesses, we have a radio, we have a series of television trials that people know about, we have the radio business that we acquired. We're doing one for print or on newspapers where we essentially build a cross-connect where we show the ads to them. All of these are targetable, are more targetable than the previous versions, but not as targetable as the core business. And so it will take longer, and they'll probably not be as profitable initially as we develop these new markets. And we keep experimenting, we keep trying. I think it's fair to say that the ad models that we have, that we're all dealing with now, will all be changed. They will all morph into something more dynamic, more personal, more entertaining, because that's how advertising sells.
Jan.
Eric, you were talking earlier about culture, And I think that, I mean, Google, when it started off, was a fun place, lots of color, toys to play with, roller hockey. And it was really sort of almost counterculture. You've suddenly gone very dry and corporate. What happened to frugal? Why do we now have the Google Internet Product Search, or whatever it's called? What happened to frugal? I mean, frugal was a brilliant name. And don't go dweebing on us.
You've not met the dinosaur we just installed in our lobby and the space shuttle replica that we have and all the balls and so forth and so on. I don't agree that the company internally has abandoned its, shall we say, colorful and bizarre roots. With respect to frugal, it didn't test that well. And we're replacing it with a much more integrated product search offering, which end users tell us is what they want. I happen to like frugal as a fun name, but in fact, the integrated answer that we're developing is a better one.
You can't call it frugal dash the Internet Product Search.
Every idea has been tried.
Yes.
Hey, Eric, it's Nina Litton. I was wondering, when you were describing what you're working on with your phone friends, and you were mentioning that you would do inspirational applications, would it be a fair guess that what you're really building is a middleware platform that's going to be in the server somewhere, and what you're showing people on the new phones will be ideas that the open community can build off of and create more of?
Well, the term middleware is sort of the term middleware, as you know, is an IT term. It's better to think of it as a set of programmatic layers, services layers
that live in the cloud.
And believe it, you actually need them on both devices. You need both on the client as well as on the server. The client needs to be able to authenticate, to offer the services, to be able to talk, and so forth and so on. The computational power of phones now enables that. So as part of what we're doing, such layers are being developed as part of building these interesting phone apps. It doesn't have a name, and it's not some new platform strategy, and it doesn't have a book that says you must do this or else, or so forth and so on. The new developer model is different in that sense, that it's much more grab bag. Take this, take this, take this from different vendors. Yeah. It's much more porous. The other thing that's interesting about these new developer programs, because of course you have covered them for many years, as many people in the audience, is that they're much more viral, and they're much more community-based. They're viral in the sense that they spread out rather than being purchased in a store or whatever. And they're community-based because Walt shows it to me, I show it to you, and then the rest of us talk about it.
Cool. Okay, thanks.
Okay, we can only do two more, and
yes,
these two were standing. I'm sorry.
A few months ago, a large company introduced a product similar to ours, which is fine. Shortly after that, if you Googled our company name, you got our company name was the first one that came up. But if you clicked on our company, you immediately went to the earphone site of the other manufacturer. We spent a fair amount of time on the phone in correspondence with Google, and was told that there was nothing illegal, and that we could basically get into a bidding war for our company name. Did we just not talk to the right people, or is that actually your policy?
You're talking about the ad side of the page or the algorithmic search?
The algorithmic search. We came up to the top of the search, and you clicked there. And
so, again, there must be some miscommunication, because there are two parts of Google. There's the algorithmic search, and there's the ads. We do allow competitors to advertise on other people's trademarks. This is controversial, but we've allowed that for a long time. So it is possible that someone is advertising in a way that's not to your liking on the ad side. We do not allow that, and we police it very, very carefully around algorithmic search. So if, for example, your website comes up under a query for your product, it should absolutely take it to your website. There are situations where people have done something called interstitials, where they'll actually superimpose the wrong website, and we detect those now. So again, there must be some miscommunication on your specific case.
I'm glad to hear that. I'll send you the correspondence.
Thank you.
Susan, last question.
Yes. Hi, Susan Line. Could you talk a little bit about your experience in China and the enormous growth of Baidu, and maybe what you've learned about cultural barriers in countries like China?
Well, China is a challenge for many American companies, and maybe all foreign companies. We are, as everybody in the room knows, we're subject to all of the appropriate Chinese laws, and we're not necessarily wild about these laws. In fact, we don't like them at all. As a result, we delayed our entry into the market for a pretty long time. During that time, Baidu became more successful. And of course, they're also subject to the same laws. When we decided to enter the market, we also decided to enter it in a somewhat different way. So, for example, if information is omitted, we actually inform the end user. We also don't keep any user-generated content. The sum of that is consistent with the principles that Google has set out, and after a long and complicated debate that everybody participated in, and we are comfortable that we made the right decision in doing that. So we'll accept the consequences. What's interesting is since we've entered and since in the last 6 months, our market share is growing and our traffic has grown very significantly, which tells you that the Chinese end user also wants more information, global information, and so forth quickly under the current model. So I think the strategy seems to be working with a late entry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Walt. Thank you all.
Good answer.